Great, we've got participants joining.
That's wonderful. Well, welcome to everyone who's just joined us. I'm going to wait for a few minutes to formally start this meeting because I can see the number of people joining is ticking round. This is very exciting. Thanks. Hope you're having a lovely morning wherever you are so far. And yeah, we'll be starting in just a few minutes. Well, welcome to everyone who's just joined us. I'm going to wait for a few minutes to formally. So you're still joining the event, which is fantastic. I see we're clicking around to about 120 people joined up so far. So I'm going to wait a few minutes until we start because I know that many more of you have actually signed up. So just bear with us a couple of minutes. The faster you join, the faster we'll start. Right, so welcome to everyone who's joined us here for this webinar looking ahead to COP26. It's fantastic to have you with us. And not just the number of people that have signed up, but the diversity of you. You've come from councils, you've come from arts groups, you're coming from the sports event, you're coming from different businesses that one might not immediately associate with climate change. It's fantastic to have you all with us this morning. My name is Richard Black. I'm the director of the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. You will see before you some of the speakers that we have lined up for this morning, and my colleague Lindsay Smith, who's going to play a key role in looking at your questions and comments as they come in, and basically managing the whole thing. And if my link goes down, then Lindsay will also be taking over as the co-host. So we now know, as of this morning, that COP26 is deferred by a year from its original date, not November this year, but November next year. So that's about 18 months away. But that's kind of an opportunity as well as a challenge, I think. It's just a longer road. It gives people more chance to work out what they want to do and how to get involved in this event. It's the first time that the UK has ever hosted one of the annual United Nations climate change meetings. And in some quarters, it's being referred to as the Olympic Games of climate change. And remember how exciting that was when the Olympics were coming to London. So we're going to hear from a few experts this morning who are going to tell us about COP26, what a COP is, how it works, how you can influence what happens there. We're going to be hearing about where we are on the science of climate change, what impact, if any, this year of coronavirus is making so far. And we're going to hear from people in diverse sectors, such as the advertising industry and the arts, on some plans that are already underway to mark this special year of, well, year and a bit now, of climate change for the UK. We're going to be taking your questions and points. If you've got anything to send in at any stage, please use the Q&A function, not the chat function, the Q&A function. If you're joining on the phone and therefore you can't use the facilities on the app, send an email to info@eciu.net. That's info@eciu.net. We'll be monitoring that as well. And towards the end of the session, we'll be bringing responses to some of your questions and points. So let me, without any further ado, pass on now. Oh no, it's one other thing I need to say, which is that if you want to tweet about this as we go on, that would be absolutely fantastic. The hashtag that we think is more appropriate for this one is hashtag Road to Glasgow, which is already in use. I think it's one that's been picked up from the Commonwealth Games 6 years ago, but nevertheless, it's still in use. And there's also the hashtag COP26, which is very much in use, of course. So now, Really. Let me pass on to our first speaker. Dr. Liz Bentley is the Chief Executive of the Royal Meteorological Society, and she's been in this business all her working life, really, working for the Met Office. She's managed the BBC Weather Centre. She's worked for the Ministry of Defence on weather and climate. So, for a look at where we are up to with climate change, I'll pass straight over to Liz.
Great, thanks, Richard. Delighted to be here. I'm just going to share my screen, and I have a few slides to go through. Can I just check you can see my slides? Is that okay? Good, great. Okay, so Richard asked me if I'd just put some kind of context behind before we get into the panel discussion, really looking at climate change. And so I decided I'd use the time to answer these 4 questions. The first one is, our climate actually changing? So what evidence is there that the climate change is happening? Second question is it down to us as human beings? Thirdly, what will we see in future? What are the climate models showing us? And then the final question, a current question, I guess, is what's the impact that COVID-19 is having on climate change? So let's start with the first one. Probably not a question I get asked that much anymore. I think there's a real kind of feeling that people just accept climate change is happening. There's lots of indicators there that it is. And I guess one of the main indicators that we can look at is temperature. So here's a really nice graphic produced by Ed Hawkins. It's the warming stripes. It shows the annual global temperature. Each of the vertical bars shows the temperature in that particular year, starting at 1850 on the left-hand side and coming through to current day on the right-hand side, so 2019 last year. And you'll see the colours depict the temperature, the annual global temperature each year, the blues, the darker the blues, the lower the temperature. And then as you get into the oranges and reds, the higher the temperature. And you'll see 2 things. One, it fluctuates from year to year. It's not just consistently going up, but there is a warming trend, particularly in the last kind of 5 or 6 decades. We've lost those blue colours and we've moved into the oranges, the reds, the darker reds as the global average temperature has increased. But it's not increasing the same everywhere. So we need to look kind of spatially around the world. And here's a picture that shows us where the temperature differences are changing differently. So the darker reds again show the higher temperatures, the more increase in temperature that we've seen. And it's the Arctic region that is warming faster than other parts of the world. In fact, it's warming twice as fast as the global average. You can see those darker reds in the Arctic region. So there's another indicator with temperature, but obviously with that warming in the Arctic, it has an impact on Arctic sea ice. So here's a really nice animation. This shows the Arctic sea ice extent. The loop starts in the late 1970s and come up to current date. We look at the Arctic sea ice extent in September, because that's when it's at its minimum. There's a red line on here you can see, which shows the Arctic sea ice extent in the 1980s. And what you'll see is that extent just gets less and less. Again, it fluctuates from year to year, but there's a decrease as we go forward in time coming up to current date. So that warming that we've seen in the atmosphere, particularly that excessive warming we've seen in the Arctic, is having an impact on the Arctic sea ice. So there's another indicator that our climate is changing. We can also look at glaciers, so glacial retreat. So here's an example of a glacier in Canada, in Alberta. We can see some pictures here as the glacier, as the atmosphere is warmed, the glacier retreats back up the valley. So we've got some pictures here from 1924. And then as you move through to the 1980s and into 2011, you'll see that glacier retreating back up the valley. So another indicator that our atmosphere is warming, and we're seeing the warming at the surface on our land. But we've also got warming taking place in the oceans as well. And another indicator of that, we can look at coral bleaching. So here's a before and after image of some fire coral taken in Bermuda. On the left-hand side, you can see the vibrant colours of that fire coral. So this were obviously before the ocean's temperatures warmed up. And on the right-hand side, with that warming of the oceans, we get this bleaching effect of the coral. So again, another indicator that our oceans are warming. And with that warming in the ocean, we get a thermal expansion. So warmer water expands, it takes up a greater volume. And so we'll see an increase in sea level rise. So we get a thermal expansion, but we also get a flow of ice, the glacial ice or land ice flowing off into the sea. and we see sea level rise. So there's a really nice animation here showing how our sea levels have risen from the late 1800s up to current date. You can see that steady increase of sea level rise over time because of that thermal expansion, the warming of the oceans, and the flow of ice from land into the oceans, as well as our atmosphere warms. And I guess one of the things that I struggle, I guess, in the UK is that people say, well, these things are happening elsewhere. They're not really focusing on the UK. Well, we're an island, so we have seen global sea level rises around the UK, and we'll continue to see that. And that will impact on us for some of our coastal cities. London, for example, and the Thames estuary will be impacted by that, and obviously coastal regions as well. But there are some indicators in the UK of our climate changing. So we're seeing hotter, drier summers, and we'll continue to see those as we go forward. We get these extreme temperature events. We've seen some record-breaking temperatures in the winter, but particularly in the summer as well. And that has an impact on us as humans. We see the death rate increases as we reach those extreme high temperatures, but it also has an impact on our infrastructure. You can see here, you know, buckling of the railway lines, melting of our roads. Our infrastructure isn't built for those extremely high temperatures that we're now starting to see. We're also seeing warmer, wetter winters, and again, that will continue as we move forward in time. With two effects here, we get a warmer atmosphere, holds more moisture, so we get these heavier downpours of rain, leading to more kind of flash flooding events. But we're also seeing more heavier rainfall events for longer periods, and obviously we've seen those quite recently with rivers bursting their banks, widespread flooding events that go on for days on end. So the impact is not just globally, it's here in the UK. So the next question is, okay, we've lots of evidence that climate is changing, but is this down to us? And the one key thing that we look at when we think about how our climate is changing is we focus in on greenhouse gases, the main contributors to why we've seen a warming in our atmosphere. And one of those greenhouse gases, main one really, is carbon dioxide levels. So there's a graph here that shows the carbon dioxide concentration levels in the atmosphere from the early 1700s. So we were about 280 parts per million back in the 1700s. And then that increased as we went into the late 1800s. And we've seen a rapid increase in the concentrations of carbon dioxide in the last 7 or 8 decades. And we're now well over 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide concentrations in our atmosphere. The largest amount of carbon dioxide concentrations we've seen in over 3 million years, so excessive amounts. And carbon dioxide is one of our main greenhouse gases, but there are other ones such as methane, for example. And greenhouse gases actually capture the radiation that comes in, it warms the atmosphere and it stops the release of that radiation back out into space. So it acts like a blanket, I guess, as it causes the atmosphere to keep warming and heating up. And that's the link between our greenhouse gas emissions and the warming that we've seen, those indicators that I showed in our changing climate. So where do all these greenhouse gases come from? Where, you know, what are the contributing to putting those emissions in the atmosphere? Well, here's a nice infographic just showing the breakdown, the percentages of how those greenhouse gases go into the atmosphere. And you can see each one of these, the size of them depict the percentage. So about a quarter of it comes from electricity and heat. About a fifth comes from agriculture and land, so how we use the land and farming, for example. And you can see each of these there's a human influence. It's how we live our lives and do our farming and use our different sectors contributes to greenhouse gas emissions in our atmosphere. And if we wanted to think about how we might mitigate climate change, we need to think about how we can reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we emit in the atmosphere, how we can get down to putting no greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So doing things less or changing the way we do things, maybe, for example, using renewable energies that don't burn fossil fuels and release that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So what can the future hold? So we have lots of climate models that predict what the atmosphere is going to be like in the future. And I could have decided to choose many different graphics. I've decided to focus in on the UK and to look at temperature in particular. So these are some climate projections of temperature increases looking across this current century. And so on the left, we have the current period that we're in. We're already seeing an increase of more than 1 degree warming in our temperature in the UK. And as we move into the middle of the century, so the middle graphic, you'll see that warming increases to the kind of close to 2 degrees and 2 degrees in the southeast of England, warming. And as we move to the end of the century, then we're looking at an increase of nearly 3 degrees across the UK. So you can see as we go forward through this century, these increases will continue as our climate continues to change. Now, these numbers might seem quite small, I guess, a couple of degrees, does that really make a difference? Well, it does actually, and I'll move on to this final graphic looking at future climate change. So we see these small changes in temperature, but actually they'll have a really big impact on the frequency of the extremes that we'll see. So this is a graph that shows our temperatures. We could be our temperatures in the UK, and most of the temperatures that we see lie within a middle range, so no real extremes. We have a few outliers that go into the extreme heat and a few that go into the extreme cold. So the cold winters and the very warm winters, but very few of them. So maybe the frequency might be 1 in every 10 years, for example. But if we add that very small increase in the average temperature, so a small shift to the right of this curve, what you'll see if you focus on the extreme heat, the frequency goes up quite significantly. So maybe those 1 in 10 year events now become something that happens every other year. So the frequency increases quite dramatically. And the converse to that, the extreme cold events, the ones that might have happened 1 in every 10 years, almost disappear completely. So that small shift in average temperature actually has a really big impact in the frequency of extreme events that we might expect in the UK and elsewhere in the world. And the final question about the impact that COVID-19 may have had on climate change, I saw this graphic used last week by the Met Office, so I decided to pinch it. And it basically is a really nice infographic that shows the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. So they've depicted the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere as water in a bathtub. And the amount that we emit into the atmosphere is the rate that we turn the tap, the flow of water into the bath. And so there's some lines that have been drawn on the side of the bath. At the end of 2019, the bath had filled up to the black line that you can see here. And as we would have gone into 2020 without the pandemic, we would have continued to fill that bath up to continue to emit carbon dioxide levels into the atmosphere. And we would have expected by the end of 2020 to have reached this orange line. But the pandemic and the fact that we've gone into lockdown for a period of time, we've slowed the rate. We've turned that tap down a little bit. We've slowed the rate of emissions into the atmosphere. We haven't stopped it. We haven't pulled the plug out of the bath. So we're not seeing a reduction, but we've seen a slowing in the rate. So the expectation is by the end of this year, the carbon dioxide concentrations will have got up to this green line. So again, it just shows there has been an impact in the amount of emissions of carbon dioxide that we're putting in the atmosphere because of COVID-19, but we're not seeing a reduction in the carbon dioxide concentration. We haven't pulled that plug out of the bath, as I say. So I'll leave it there and pass back to Richard.
Thanks very much, Liz. Wonderful. So if you would mind stopping sharing your screen now, that's fantastic. And especially for those who've joined us a little bit late, just to let you know, if you have any questions, Liz will be around till the end of the session and able to answer any of your questions on climate science and so on. Use the Q&A function, please, not the chat function on Zoom, or if you're joining on the phone, and you can't use the app, email info@eciu.net and we'll pick out the best of your questions and comments for the end. Let me now pass over swiftly to our second speaker, who is Dr. Alison Doig. Now, Alison's been working in this area of climate change and sustainable development for 20 years. She's been working most recently with Christian Aid, has been to at least 8 COPs, and is actually a native of Glasgow, where the next one's going to be held, which is fantastic. So any bar recommendations you need, Alison is there. And I'm delighted to say, actually, Alison is joining us next week, joining ECIU to lead our international work. It's fantastic. So what happens at a COP? What's the role of the host government? How can people like you get involved and help shape what happens? Over to you, Alison.
Okay, can you see that screen okay? No, I've lost you.
We're hearing you fine, Alison, but we're not seeing a shared screen at the moment, no.
I click the button, try again. Oh yes, I know what I need to do. Missed one. There we go. Can you see that fine?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, so COP26 is coming to Glasgow. We now know it'll be next year, 2021, in November. It's been hosted by the UK, but in partnership with Italy. So there'll be a pre-meeting in Italy, and Italy will be there alongside the UK throughout the events. So basically, this is a European, not a European Union, but a European COP. It moves around the different parts of the world each year. So if you want a simple answer to what is a COP, the COP is the Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's not simple, is it? But basically, it is an enormous, and I mean enormous, conference of 200 plus countries, people from around the world, NGOs, indigenous communities, just a huge gathering of people. The aim of that conference is for the world to work together to stop the horror we just heard about. I mean, I always get terrified when I see that type of graph that we've just seen. And also to support the most vulnerable people through that climate impact that is already very, very much happening. So it's countries coming together to make that change. But of course, it might sound easy. But when you get 200 countries who, you've got Saudi Arabia, US, Canada, Australia, you've also got Tuvalu, some of the tiny little Pacific Island states who are already threatened. I mean, their whole existence is being threatened by climate change. You've got Sudan, you've got, you name it. We've got countries around the world who all have different ideas of how to respond, different vested interests, whether it's in fossil fuels or whether it's in urgent action, or if it's Bangladesh, how do I, compensate farmers when the sea encroaches their fields? So actually, the more you go into it, the more complex it gets. I'll try and make it less complex. So if I can get my system to work, go on. Okay, it is now not sharing the screen. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So what Glasgow is about this year, 2020 is the year that the Paris Agreement comes into play. The Paris Agreement is the most current, global, almost all country of the world coming together saying, yes, we will act together on climate change. Paris didn't come out of nowhere. There was a whole, just to tell you where it came from, that little mini brief history of how we got to the Paris Agreement. So in the 1980s, it was really when this idea of climate change started to be talked about. Scientists were saying it. There were just some of the fossil fuel companies were getting a little bit tetchy about this discussion, but it was starting to bubble up. And in fact, I've got a picture there of John Major signing the Rio Earth Summit, the Earth Agreement that happened, originated in 1992. But in fact, in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher, as originally a chemist, was very vocal and started to show concerns on climate change, really recognising this is an issue that the UK should be engaged with. And all through this history, the different players from the UK have been championing change and activity. So it started with the countries coming together in '92 at the Rio Earth Summit. And that is where the UN Convention on Climate Change, Framework Convention on Climate Change was put together. It was also when the Convention on Biodiversity was put together. China was due to host the Convention on Biodiversity conference this year. Again, it's been postponed. Those two started there. Out of that was born the Kyoto Protocol, and everyone will have heard of the Kyoto Protocol. And that was signed by 192 countries. US was out, but all that was only compliant on the rich countries. And the rich countries pledged to reduce their emissions by just a meager 5%. But it was a start. You can see the timeline here. Actually, the Kyoto Protocol kicked off in '97. And then you had the Blair government, people like John Prescott really pushing hard on getting Kyoto Protocol implemented, but it didn't really start and come into play till 2008. And so it's been really slow start, but it's really picked up since then, sort of in these UN terms. So realizing actually to 2008 to 2012, we needed a replacement for Kyoto, and they tried to replace Kyoto and update it in 2009. at a huge conference, the biggest of these in Copenhagen. But it went wrong. The US, China, the big players tried to create this conference, the outcome themselves, and it didn't work. At that point, the developing countries said, we want more, and we want it to come much, much faster. We want all to be pulling together. So that retracted, rethought, and came back in Paris for the Paris Agreement. So what is the Paris Agreement? The next slide is very busy. Focus on the blue. The main outcome and the biggest outcome of the Paris Agreement was this recognition of the need to hold temperatures, global rise. We see they're already going up. In the UK, already beyond 1 degree. To hold it below 2 degrees, and if at all possible, to save those small island states, to save the most vulnerable countries in the world, we really need to keep global temperatures and do everything to stay below 1.5. And that means mitigation, cutting carbon. Countries presented their nationally determined contributions. That's basically saying how much carbon they're going to cut in the coming years. When the countries came together and presented, this is how much I'll cut between 2020 and 2025, you add it all up, and it's not enough. I mean, we know that actually the emissions reductions are taking us towards 3 degrees. And that's one of the critical issues for Glasgow, is whether the countries are willing to come back, raise their NDCs, raise their carbon cutting in the next 5-10 years, enough to stay below 2 degrees. A few countries have already come back with a raised ambition. Most of them developing countries, but the rich nations, Japan put forward a tentative one, wasn't enough. It recognized it wasn't enough. It will come back with another, hopefully much higher reduction target for 2025. The UK has committed to having an enhanced, a much improved carbon reduction target coming up in the future. The other thing is to have a long-term trajectory. The UK has said it will go net zero. It will produce no more carbon than it can absorb by 2050. It's encouraging other countries to take that line alongside it. And adaptation. There was a commitment on adaptation to protect the most vulnerable countries and help them manage the changing climate that we've seen in the science. Alongside that, actually, there was one more: loss and damage. In some cases, if you are one of these small Pacific islands and your sea is encroached, you don't have enough rainwater for basic living, you will have to evacuate that island. If your farm is flooded with seawater, it will no longer grow. So what do you do in a case of loss and damage? And that's a really controversial issue that many countries are keeping a close eye on. It sounds simple, but who pays up? Who caused it? The damage. There's a whole stream around technology, innovation, and a significant one that actually Gordon Brown was the first to say in terms of finance, that there should be 100 billion of finance to help poor countries around the world every year, and that's meant to have happened by now. So Glasgow doesn't happen, boom, it suddenly happens. There's pre-mates, Italy's going to co-host, so there'll be a whole series of meetings and where opportunities for countries to come together and present their enhanced NDCs, their long-term goals, really push the effort. The UK, as we'll hear, has got a huge diplomatic effort. This is entirely global. Every country of the world, the Commonwealth, well beyond, has to be in there and active for it to work. The UK, we hope, will be leading at home. And we will start to see and increasingly see impacts of real climate change over the next 16, 18 months around the world. So when it comes to it, what will it look like? So this is the venue in Glasgow. I'm really excited about it being in Glasgow, and I'm sure there'll be a huge welcome there. There are different bubbles when you actually get to a COP, when you actually get to that point where we're negotiating, and the COPs each year do that critical negotiation. Week 1 is about the technical detail. Week 2 is about the political decision-making. Ministers, sometimes heads of states, come to really make those critical decisions. So you will see a number of parties, they call them parties, that's member countries from around the world. The EU's been seen as a leader. The US, critical, the elections this year, will it be Trump, will it be Biden? There'll be a significant difference in the US engagement depending on that. Small island states are a critical player. China, will it come forward with increased measures? And then, of course, Alok Sharma is going to be the COP president alongside Boris Johnson. heading that up. I'm sure in the fringes we'll see Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish Parliament wanting to play their own role while we're there. You'll see many what they call non-government NGOs, and that's not just your Greenpeaces and your WWFs, they'll be there, but it's environment NGOs, business, bingos, business there, research, youth, trade unions, Indigenous people, local authorities, women's groups, farmers. You'll see faith there. The Pope has spoken out hugely on this. It's really urgency in terms of having a fair outcome, and many Islamic leaders are taking an interest. So you've got this bubble of countries who make decisions, observers on the inside, and if you want to be on the inside, you need to register yourself, and there's a process to really get on the inside. And then there's the outside, and that's the big activity, the demonstrations, the talks, the business is lobbying. There's so many people that sit around this big conference while you're there. It's so much life in it. It's amazing. All urging this action on climate change, but all got their own interest on the outcome and how it plays out in the final agreement. Of course, you'll have media there. I've put in there the ECIU Road to Glasgow newsletter, which you can sign up for on the website. But media were there with all stories, with all of the human stories, but also the impact stories, and playing their significant role. So we're hoping that we'll get enhanced commitments. We're hoping there'll be new finance, projections of site finance into the future. Interestingly, to deliver those outcomes, we need what are called coalitions of the willing, countries coming to say that they'll power past coal, that they'll all do net zero, that they'll help with adaptation. So that's countries coming together in the fringes of the conference to say they'll do much more. We're hoping there'll be increased public awareness through this whole, certainly in the UK, and action. And I think action is something I've been asked just to touch on, things that you can do. I mean, this sounds as though it's very remote. It's big countries making big agreements, but my experience with COP is that if people are there, if people are watching, if people are criticizing or calling on or cheering, it makes a huge impact in these conferences. So get informed, talk about it with your groups, join campaigns where you think they, can really target the change you want to see. Write to your MP, talk to your council. I would really encourage many of you to link to vulnerable countries, to whether you're a council, link to a council in a vulnerable country, or a theatre group, or whatever you are, really get the feel for the impacts people are feeling around the world and bring that home. And start to make those changes at home yourself. There's a lot you can do, and there's a lot to influence. Thank you.
Great, lovely. Thanks so much, Alison. And of course, in this coronavirus time, that's one thing we can do, actually, hook up with a council or something like this on the other side of the world. So just a reminder again to those who've joined us late that Alison will be staying around to the Q&A at the end of this session. So any questions, points you have, please fire them in on the Q&A function. Let me move swiftly on now to our next speaker. So Nigel Topping is the UK's high-level climate action champion. So no pressure, Nigel. Working with other countries and with businesses and all kinds of what are called in the jargon actors, which are not people who go on stage and talk for a living, although some of them may be, but basically companies and anyone that can make a difference, basically. Nigel is kind of in charge of all that for the UK. Had a few internet troubles, I believe, this morning, Nigel, hence joining us on the mobile. Anyway, over to you right away. Nigel, I don't know if you can hear us, but I think we're seeing a frozen version at the moment. If you've got, I wonder if it's worth just going on to audio only, Nigel. I think it is probably a bandwidth problem your end. Give it a shot now. No, we're still not hearing you, Nigel, I'm afraid. What I suggest is that we move on and we'll try and get you back. Lindsay, I don't know if you can find a way of getting in touch with.
All over my face, I mean, routers.
No, I'm afraid it's not. No, it's not going to work. I'm afraid we're getting about one word in every 10, and that's sort of a bit like a Dalek. So
can you hear me?
No, no. Again, it's a bit no.
Hi,
Not really.
Richard. I've got.
No, do you want to? That's it.
Sorry to be rude, but I've removed him because I think it was just getting a bit back and forthy. So yeah, I think your suggestion is great. Let's just carry on, and then hopefully I won't get told off for removing the UK's COP champion from the webinar.
Yes, that's right. Well, if you're able to get in touch with him, Lindsay, and just see if we can get him back in some other way, that would be great. I know he's a bit limited on time today, so we may not succeed with that, but let's give it a shot anyway. So let me go on actually to our rather exciting panel. Usually if you come to a webinar on climate change, you'll find that everyone involved is a sort of, from climate change. They'll be working for an NGO or a think tank or an academic or something like this. But what we wanted to do this morning was really look at people who are in sectors of society that you might not immediately link with climate change, but who've decided to do something or other to sort of mark the fact that the UK is hosting this climate summit and get their sector involved, run ideas on what they can do to influence the course of COP26. And it's probably worth saying, of course, that what happens in those 10 days in Glasgow is really largely determined by what happens in the year and a half that leads up to Glasgow, because by the time everyone gets there, a lot of stuff has been agreed. So I'm going to ask each of our 4 panelists just to briefly introduce themselves and where they come into this picture, starting with Claire Poole, CEO of Sport Positive. Claire.
Hi everyone, thank you very much, and apologies for my late arrival. Lovely to see you all. So I'm Claire Poole, I'm the founder of Sport Positive. We essentially work with sport in terms of increasing momentum around emissions reduction coming out of professional sport, helping them both from an operational perspective and also engaging fans and consumers around key climate issues. We host the Sport Positive Summit, which was due to be in March, now happening in October, and that summit is in collaboration with the UNFCCC and the International Olympic Committee and part of Year of Climate Action, and all of our work really is underpinned by the UNFCCC Sport for Climate Action programme, which I was involved with helping set up. So yeah, we're all about sports. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, lovely. And James Best, Chair of the Advertising Association's Climate Action Group.
Indeed I am. The Advertising Association is the organisation which brings together all the different sectors of the advertising ecosystem. So it's agencies, it's client advertiser companies, and it's media platforms. And the Climate Action Group that the Ad Association has set up, which I'm chairing, has representatives from all those different sectors on it. And our task that we've been given is to measure and to report on and to recommend how to improve the carbon emissions of the advertising core business, if you like, and also to think about how we can work more effectively with our partners in media, with advertisers, and looking out to the general public to help climate action succeed.
Yeah, it's been really remarkable actually to see how interest in this in the advertising industry has been increasing in the recent months, really. Fanny Calder, Director of Purpose, World Tour Futures. What's that all about?
So hi, Richard, and hello, everybody. I have been a climate change campaigner for 30 years, and I've recently taken a strange move into the pop music world. I think I'm probably the only climate change campaigner that's in charge of a major program of events and content creation around climate change. But World Tour was really set up because we saw a space, we knew the entertainment industry wanted to step in, that pop stars and other influencers are increasingly wanting to use their voice. A lot of them are young, that their generation absolutely understands how terrifying climate change is. But there hasn't been any really consistent effort to, and over time, not just at moments, but over a long period, to engage that industry and to use their amazing power to activate and inspire. And that's what we're doing. We were before COVID building a global series of events in cities around the world. I was actually in Melbourne about to do our first concert with Miley Cyrus, supporting loads of local climate activists, talking about the bushfires when shutdown happened, when lockdown happened. But what we've done is, I think for us, that's been a very positive move, because we're focusing much more on online and on how we can, at this point in time, where actually it's quite easy to access pop stars. They're desperate to speak to their audiences, and we're really working out what voice they should be using on the climate issue in general, and very much building up towards driving more political action at COP.
Okay, and thanks. And joining us from Glasgow, Gurjit Singh Lally, who's the TEDx curator, and you've got lots of exciting things planned, I think, Gurjit.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, in sunny Glasgow. I wish I could plan the weather for our COP event next year. Yep, so I'm involved with TED Talks, and specifically TEDx Glasgow. We've been running for 9 years now, and we organize an event with about 2,000 attendees. And we live stream globally using the BBC. And yeah, we've got some major events planned pre-COP, during COP, and post-COP as well.
Just tell us a bit more about that, Gurjit, if you would, because obviously now that interval has got a lot longer, hasn't it? Rather than the sort of 8 months we thought we had at the beginning of the year, we've now got 18. So what are you planning to roll out?
So we only recently heard that it's going to be extended again. We thought it might be in spring next year. So that's had its own challenges. But TED's very much a digital format and physical format. And the physical part is brilliant, because you really the serendipity of meeting people outside of your peer group and having conversations that matter. And we need that level of engagement to that intimacy and to create real relationships. Moving that on to digital is hugely challenging. I mean, the production side is quite straightforward. There's loads of platforms out there, and the BBC is our partner. So technically, it's not complicated. But how do you create intimacy? How do you build relationships? And how do you have that serendipity of bumping into somebody in the coffee queue and having that fascinating conversation with a scientist, a creative leader, and a policymaker? That part is more challenging. But yes, we have we've developed a program of virtual gatherings that we'll be launching towards the end of June, where we'll bring in diversity of thought, a bit similar to this call actually, experts from different sectors to talk about a similar challenge and give those perspectives. So quite excited about that. The virtual space is a new space for us. So really looking forward to it.
Fanny, obviously your artists will have had to reschedule lots of things again because of this extension in time period and because of COVID-19. How are you hoping that this series of events will actually influence COP26? What happens there?
Well, I think if we look back to Paris and what was successful about Paris, I think that there was a really brilliant effort around communications and messaging, particularly at an elite level. So the big strapline in Paris was clean energy is unstoppable. That worked really well politically. I would argue it probably didn't connect with a mass audience. And I think that that's what pop is all about. So I think the primary job when I'm thinking about working with the pop industry is thinking about what are those core messages that we absolutely need that will create the political space and create the momentum that we need in the lead up to Glasgow. And I think that what's fundamental to that is, the COVID moment creates such an opportunity there, because I was talking to someone earlier today about how really the combination of 2019, when the world sort of woke up to climate change in an extraordinary way that I don't think any of us had dreamed was going to happen, with the climate strikes and here with the Extinction Rebellion and with Greta's sort of ascendancy. Then we went into COVID lockdown, and I think that mentally we've been a bit like going to a festival, so suddenly you can imagine the world as a different place. And I think that that's what we've really got to drive home over the next 18 months, is the idea that not only can the world be a different place, but it must be, and that transformation needs to be radical and that it could be brilliant in loads of ways. And I think that for us, that's the messaging that I think we need to get. It's got to be celebratory, but also super urgent, super demanding. And I think that that's something that pop culture is already starting to embrace. And that's what we will be reinforcing. When we can do events, we'll do that, but it's something that we can definitely do online. And hopefully we can have a crescendo of that kind of messaging once we actually get to COP.
Like the arts, advertising, James, has a huge, what's called a brain print. It's not just the footprint of what companies do, it's the influence that they have on public opinion and so on. Tell us concretely a little bit more what ideas are around in the industry for how you can use your influence in the 18 months to COP26.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. I mean, advertising communicates on behalf of hundreds of thousands of different entities. Most of them are business. Most of what advertising does is, of course, commercial, and we have to face up to that. And in turning the sort of super tanker of the market around, advertising can definitely play a role. And I'm absolutely with Fanny on the point about communication being fundamental to achieving the sort of policy changes and the sort of behavioral changes that we need to see in the short order, preferably. The delay of COP is a shame, but I'm glad in a way it's been delayed by the full year, because there's an awful lot of work for the government to do, which I'm not sure has really landed yet. And I hope that communication and the strategy and how we're going to get people's hearts and minds behind the sort of policy wonk decisions and economics which baffle and confuse is part of the government's planning from the very beginning, and that the advertising industry, which has so many different facets, as you know, it's thousands of different companies, can play its part in helping that process, whether it's helping government, whether it's helping NGOs, whether it's companies themselves taking action and using their own advertising to support and to further the kind of goals that we all need to see the governments of the world championing themselves. So we do have a role to play, I am sure, and how it develops, is to a lot of is up to us, really, and it's up to all the different companies, and it's up to the collective action that we're seeking those companies to sign up to.
Yeah, I mean, if Nigel were here, and he can't be, and by the way, we have lost Nigel for this session. He had an internet meltdown this morning, hence trying on the phone, but as we saw, that didn't work. So he sends his apologies to everyone. Sorry not to be there. But if he was here, I think he'd be talking about, advertising and other businesses. There's things you can do, and there's things you can stop doing as well. I mean, as well as using what you might call constructive and creativity, might we see, for example, the advertising industry declining to advertise airlines or declining to advertise companies that didn't want to reduce their carbon footprints?
It would be lovely if there was one thing actually called the advertising industry. Yeah. As I say, there isn't. There are many thousands of companies, be they advertisers, be they individual businesses using search, or be they the agencies, both creative and media, that act as interfaces between media and clients of all descriptions. So yes, there are already some agencies who have turned their face away from the sort of client businesses that they believe are genuinely not helping and not seeming to want to help. There are those agencies that will not work for fossil fuel companies, understandably, like investors choosing not to do so. But that's not something which one can mandate. It's something which we have to work along quite, I suspect, a long path to get industry backing and collective backing behind higher standards of our own behavior. And we have to set our own house in order first, I think, before we can start preaching to others, but also to try to influence through our relationships with clients and through our relationships with media owners, that sort of better, if you like to call it that, behavior on their part, to influence the briefs that become communications, to influence the strategies and the marketing where we have a role to play before it gets to the execution of the ads themselves. So a lot of people want to do that. It's an industry full of a lot of very young, very bright people who are very concerned about this issue. And that's one of the reasons why we believe we can move forward, as well as a lot of clients who want us to change their own behavior and want us to communicate that. And it's critical that the communication lands with people at large if we're really going to win the hearts and minds that need to stand behind radical new policies.
Claire, one of the intriguing things you mentioned was that there's already a tie-up between sport and climate change at the United Nations level. Tell us a bit about that, how it came about and what's actually happening with it.
Yeah, so UNFCCC, I'm sure you know, through their global climate action efforts, look to different sectors to mobilise awareness and communications around climate change. So sport and fashion were two that they looked into in 2017, and I worked with them on helping bring together the stakeholder group to get the Sports for Climate Action framework off the ground. So essentially it manifested and was launched at the COP in Katowice. So nearly 2 years ago now, and as we had a group of founding members, and it's essentially 5 principles that sports organisations adhere to across reducing their climate impact, communicating and educating fans, and really helping to try and put climate change concerns at the core of sports organisations' efforts, basically. We're up to about 150 global sports organisations now, from leagues, clubs, federations, governing bodies, and looking to expand all the time. So it's fantastic. There's quite a few high-profile UK sports signatories. So Wimbledon, the AELTC, the FA, Forest Green Rovers, of course, Hibernian football clubs. You know, there's a lot of UK organisations that have already signed up, SailGP, but we are looking, especially in the run-up to COP, to really ask UK sports organisations to get behind this and focus on it and have it as an amazing legacy in the run-up and following the COP as well.
And how does this translate at local level? I mean, if I play football for a team in Yorkshire, let's say, or I play cricket for a team in Devon, how can I get involved in this? And specifically, how can I use the power of my team and the ones I play against to actually influence the COP26?
So any sports organisation can sign up to the framework. So we spent a long time putting it together so that it's equally applicable to your local cricket team as to FIFA and the IOC. So we haven't, we set the principles in place so that they could be used in that way. Shall I stop? Nigel's arrived.
just continue to the end of that, Claire, because it's really interesting. And welcome back, Nigel. Glad you can make it.
So yeah, it's equally applicable, and we have a lot of grassroots organisations already signed up to the framework, and essentially it gives you the manifesto to focus your work around these 5 principles, and the communication element, as Fanny touched on and as we're talking about, is so incredibly important. So sports footprint comparative to other industries is very small, but its reach is massive. So in terms of that communication, the same as music, and I think sport and music have so much in common in terms of festivals and large sporting events, etc. Same imprint, similar reach. So it's a pillars to follow in terms of your work, but also working groups of joining with other like-minded organisations to fast track some of these learnings and not keep making the same errors over and over again.
Excellent, thank you. I want to come back to Fanny in a moment and ask a similar question about sort of local arts groups and so on up and down the UK. But seeing as Nigel has got his screwdriver out and mended his internet, widened the pipe of bits from his home into the world, let's go straight over to you, Nigel, if we may. Thanks very much for coming back. Wonderful.
Thanks, Richard, and really sorry. I finally got hold of the internet service provider, said there's a big server down somewhere, so it's not all my scrabbling around with the screwdriver didn't fix anything, but somebody in a server farm's fixed it. So apologies to jump in the middle and to interrupt Claire. I'm really intrigued to hear more about sports and music and how they can lend their shoulders to the wheels, so to speak. But Richard, should I just go back to what I was going to say in the first place? And
yes, please, Nigel. Yeah.
I thought maybe I'll just explain my role a bit. Some of you know in detail who are real UNFCCC watchers, and some of you all think, what on earth is a high-level climate action champion? So my role was created in Paris alongside the Paris Agreement by the parties, by the countries. They call themselves parties. I heard you saying, Richard, that just as actors aren't necessarily in the UN speak people who stand on the stage, parties aren't also necessarily things with beer and balloons. So when I say parties, I mean the countries who are the parties to the UNFCCC, the United Nations Climate Convention. So the countries created this role in recognition of the fact that countries can't solve climate change on their own. Both politically, we need businesses, investors, cities, states and regions, and all of civil society to do whatever they can individually and to create the political pressure and momentum and legitimacy to encourage policymakers to be bolder. So the role was created with that small mandate to work with all those communities to drive ambition and action, and to use that to support countries in being more ambitious. My background's in the private sector in the first half of my career, and then last 13 years been working on climate change and the sort of nexus of investors, business and policymakers, and then until December was leading an organization called We Mean Business, really, which came together to drive a progressive business voice to support ambition in the run up to Paris and beyond. So I work, it's the job's supposed to be 2 years, it's now going to be nearly 3, right? Because we've just heard that the COP's been delayed by a year. The idea is that it runs for 2 cycles, two COP cycles, so overlaps with my predecessor and then with my successor. My predecessor's a brilliant systems entrepreneur and B Corp champion called Gonzalo Munoz from Chile. And sometimes Gonzalo and I joke that our job in many ways is just to be the kind of smart asses for ambition, right? So if you say 2050, Richard, I say 2040. If Claire says 100 organizations, I say 1,000. So we like to think we're adding zeros or taking 10 years off everybody's commitment. So really being champions for ambition, because we all know it's not a question of 2055 or 2050 or 2045. It's as soon as possible. We need to get to zero as soon as possible. So I thought in that context, we're doing a lot of work in terms of trying to support communities of change agents to bring about systems change sector by sector. But what's very front of mind for me at the moment that I wanted to share is this big campaign that we're launching next Friday, actually, so a week today, called Race to Zero. And we're calling it a race to zero because we know that we need to create a healthy, resilient zero carbon economy that creates jobs, that unlocks inclusive, sustainable growth, and improves health, and that delivers a more resilient society and economy. But we call it a race to zero because of the health implications. You know, I think that health is very much front of mind. You may have seen the letter signed by over 40 million healthcare professionals a couple of days ago, calling on governments to build back better and to put clean air and climate at the heart of recovery packages. We know that over 7 million people are dying prematurely from respiratory diseases every year. That's more than 20 times the COVID death rate globally every year because of the same pollution that's causing climate change. It's also a race to zero because of the science. You know, now we have a delayed COP. We'll have the first reports of the 6th assessment from the International Panel on Climate Change coming out before the COP. And we already know that their assessment of the risks with 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, whatever level of warming we have, their assessment of the risks will be worse than it was last time. And that's a consistent pattern. Every time the scientists come back to look at how bad the impact will be, and that's human and economic impact. And as we know, it's happening kind of right here, right now. This is not something that's going to happen to a future generation in another country. It's happening in all of our countries with extreme weather events getting worse and getting more frequent. And I like to say this is also a race to zero because of jobs. Those countries who foolishly invest in old economy jobs will be wasting taxpayers' money and undermining the competitiveness of their economy. So it's really a race for competitiveness as well. The campaign will be under the stewardship of me and Gonzalo for all non-state actors. We've been working with Oxford University and a lot of the leading initiatives to agree a set of kind of meta criteria so that platforms, and many of which I guess you're talking about now. So I'd love to hear if there's a coalition to get sporting entities to commit to net zero. Let's find a way to get that in the Race to Zero platform. Same with music, same with schools, same with universities. Our focus is on real economy actors, but as Claire said, sporting enterprises, whilst they may be relatively small in terms of economic and climate impact, they have huge reach. So we're really keen for this to be a very inclusive campaign. It forms the non-state actor, the real economy and civil society part of the Climate Ambition Alliance, which was launched by the Chilean presidency and the UN Secretary General in September last year and is now co-chaired from the countryside by the UK and Chile. We like to think of it as an example of the kind of radical collaboration that we're seeing more and more of. Just to give you an idea of some of the networks who are already in when we launch next week, the Argentinian network of municipalities. So hundreds of sometimes quite small but committed towns and townships in Argentina saying, enough, we're committed to doing what we can, we're committed to net zero. The B Corp movement, they have hundreds of B Corp businesses now committed to net zero 2030. They're really trying to raise the bar. The B Team, the UN Global Compact and Science-Based Targets 1.5-degree pledge, growing numbers of major multinational companies committing to net zero and using science-based targets as a very rigorous way they can be held to account. Deadline 2020, Fashion Charter, ICLEI, massive organization of local governments, Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, a small number but trillions of dollars worth of assets held by some of the world's biggest investors, really spearheaded by Allianz, one of the world's biggest insurers. US Climate Alliance, a growing number of US states who, despite the federal government, are committing to net zero themselves. And the Under 2 Coalition, which is a group of a very large group of regions. I think they represent about 43% of the world's population between them. So this is just the start. So we'll launch that on Friday. If you just Google it, you can find out, or Richard, we can share the information with you to share with everybody. Our target is to have a massive signal to the governments of the world from everybody who's not a government that we're all committed to net zero I like to say in the 2040s. I'm a pedantic mathematician by background. So by 2050 is the same as in the 2040s. So we'll take 31st of December 2049. And I'm serious by that because cognitively anchoring this as early as possible does matter. No one ever tries to sell you something for $9, for $10. They'll always sell it to you for $9.99 because it makes you feel like somehow you're getting it much cheaper than $10. We need to work with our own cognitive weaknesses. So getting to 10 times, we think we can get to 60% of global economy, 60 by GDP covered. So that in some of those countries where there's less ambition in the revised NDCs, the states and cities and major economic players who can do that. We think that coalitions of individuals can make a difference. We've got some partners working on a massive citizens pledge to try and roll up all the different commitments that citizens are making. And we want to make the 18 months now to Glasgow a year of the race to zero. Richard, I want to thank you and the ECIU for some of the analytical work you've done and the inspiration to set a target which is not just based on NDCs, but which is based on overall coverage of the economy. And as I say, they think this is a race for health, a race based in science, a race for jobs, and a race that we either win or lose together. So we want to, Gonzalo and I, if you like, as high-level champions, are looking to find another 7.5 billion champions to join the race to zero and make sure that by the time we get to Glasgow, we have overwhelming momentum from actors at every level of society and of the economy, making it much easier for governments to step up and be bolder in their own policy commitments. So I hope everyone will join us. And Richard, maybe through you, we can share some of the details of the launch. And if anybody's got any initiatives which are bringing in lots of stake, Gurjit, I see you there. Maybe we can have a TEDx race to zero, right? Get TEDx's to get all of their local communities to commit to net zero. And I'm sure you've all got lots of other ideas, whether it's sports, schools, universities. We've got thousands of organizations who I think want to commit to zero and will change the politics. So Richard, I'm sorry I can't stay to the end and join the Q&A. I've got to join the other thing that I'm late for now. But glad I persevered and was able to join you. And thank you everybody for all of your own leadership. And maybe Richard, we can follow up at a later stage in the series.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Nigel. Really great to have you. Really appreciate you coming back. Wonderful.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, one of the interesting things that I've found being involved with that work with Nigel's group and also now is just hearing about things you'd never hear about otherwise. Who knew that there was a group of Argentinian municipalities who were looking at moving to net zero? And that goes back to what Alison was saying about building bridges across the world using this as an opportunity. Thanks very much, Nigel. We'll definitely share that stuff. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Great. I'm conscious we've got about 25 minutes left, and I do want to move to Q&A quite soon. But let me go back to where we were. Fanny, we've just been talking about, Claire was just talking about the opportunities for local sports clubs and things to get involved. What would you say to musicians and theatre groups and so on around Britain, who are not Will Smith, who are not Miley Cyrus, but probably want to get desperately back to playing live in the next few months? How can they get involved in this whole COP26?
Well, I think, it's really interesting hearing Nigel talking about Race to Zero as a sort of umbrella mission. And I think that, coming back to my earlier point, I think I'm not convinced. I mean, I think it's a brilliant initiative. I'm not sure that that's going to grab the attention of the public. I think it's a really great way of mobilizing actors of all kinds to know what their mission is. I think there's a bit of work to do for us to frame this in popular cultural terms, this moment. And as soon as we've done that, and I think we need to do that quite rapidly, then I think it would be absolutely brilliant. That there's huge space for culture to get involved. And I think, I mean, you know, we all are planning now, use this strange time we're in now to think about how you can engage. And I think one thing that I try and bring to culture is enabling culture to think about itself as a political chess piece. So, you know, looping back the conversation, I think there's a bit of a thing we haven't mentioned, and we're talking about race to zero and net zero and all of that, is that governments around the world are about to spend even more money on trying to get us out of this COVID moment. So I think that it's absolutely critical that we pile in culturally with every lever we've got to try and influence where those decisions go, because if that money doesn't get spent in the right way, we're going to have missed a huge opportunity. So I think that, you know, I think what I hope that culture is going to be able to do, and what you can do at any level, is to start saying, okay, well, we do want to build that better future. We do want to build back better. We want climate action to be a part of what at every level of government is happening in every community. And we all want to think also, we want to rethink as we re-enter the world, we want to rethink the choices that we're making. And I think that that's a conversation that we can be having everywhere. So it's what are our diets? What are our transport choices? Do we really desperately want to get back on planes? Luckily not at the moment, because we're frightened. So I think if culture can be thinking about that, and that's not a particularly specific answer, I realize, but I think that actually a lot of the benefit of culture is that it's diverse and people will speak to their local audiences in ways that make sense to them. But I think as long as we have that build back better message going up towards COP, I think we'll be winning. And then just to finish, I think thinking about what actually happens during the moment, obviously, you know, as we were talking about earlier, the more this can feel like a festival, like the Olympics, the more it can feel that cultural things are happening across the country that are celebrating and calling for more action, and also calling for the bad things to stop, and being really clear about that, really vilifying fossil fuels as well as building back this better future, then I think we'll be in a brilliant position. And we're actually, one of the things I didn't mention earlier that I should have mentioned is that we're talking to there's a young team who have already developed ideas about actually staging events at COP in Glasgow, and staging a series, and they've got an initiative called Climate Live that we're hopefully going to partner with to support, so we can kind of bring in our big guns around that and make magic happen during the event. But as I say, we need to start planning now.
So in terms of the global economy, it's time for Will Smith to do a sequel about doing that, which presumably would be called I Reboot. Sorry, couldn't resist that one.
I'll pitch it in.
Good. What's happening in Glasgow? How's Glasgow itself preparing for this event?
Well, Glasgow's got experience from the Commonwealth Games, which was a huge event that took place in the summer, which is a little bit easier logistically to coordinate because a lot of the Glaswegians, are abroad enjoying their vacations. But this conference is going to be taking place during one of our busiest times of the year, when a lot of people will be commuting back and forth to their offices, their workplaces. So logistically, it's hugely challenging for the knowns and the unknowns. Therefore, we're planning our major TEDx event prior to the COP event itself, and to be one of the feeders into the COP event. And we're hoping to engage and mobilize and inspire millions of people around the world to then pledge to what their commitment will be, what behavioral changes they want to make, and then use that data to pass on to policymakers so that they can make evidence-based decisions. So it's really exciting, inspiring times. There is a little bit of a question around Scottish government's input around this, because it is very much a UK government lead. And our First Minister is very active in the space of a well-being economy and a just transition. which links really nicely into the Adam Smith values. So we're hoping to showcase some of what Scotland's doing, and also lots of learning from around the world of what Scotland could be doing.
Yeah, cheers, Gidget. All right, I'm going to move to some of your questions now, and thanks so much for sending them in. If you do want to get something in quickly, reminder to use the chat, the Q&A function, please, not the chat function. And if you're on the phone and can't use the app at all, send an email to info@eciu.net. Alison, I think one for you that's come up here. But bearing in mind, this, drawing on the kind of things that changes we're all making to our lives, could COP be done virtually? Could we, and I guess we're talking about the UN Climate Secretariat Convention itself, should they be using virtual meetings more often between COPs?
I think we'll have to, and I think we've learned we can. I've got two minds about this. One, yes, a lot more could be done without traveling, without the carbon footprint of people moving around. There are a couple of issues with that, though, is that assumes that you're from a country that has really effective internet connections. We even had that here just within the UK. But not all countries are as effective, or as, I think there's a building of capacity to actually be able to engage. There's an imbalance of power often online that you might not get in person. There's a concern for those sitting around it, how engaged the NGOs, the wider community, the business community, how they play in those roles, because they play a big part at these conferences in terms of talking, exchanging, giving information, getting bits of intelligence. It's a complex system once you're into that negotiating phase. And I think a lot of that will be lost. And I think the transparency, how closed are the meetings, how open are they? So there's a few dynamics going on there that I think would be lost by moving it entirely online. Also just creating that moment, having those people, putting the pressure. When we were in Paris, one of the reasons we got the 1.5 is because the world, civil society, media, business were looking at that conference actively and physically, and that put pressure directly onto the countries. So I think a lot more we've shown can happen. There was the Petersburg discussion recently that was very successful. It was largely online. So a lot can be done, but we need it to be transparent, open, and I think coming together actually for that kind of interaction and engagement and scrutiny is really important. So maybe a bit more of a blend from now on.
Great, thanks, Alison. Liz, one for you, I think. Someone here's put a question. We're seeing a bit of a rise again in questioning of climate science. I'm not sure whether the question is referring so much to the UK or globally, but is this something that the scientific community is still concerned about, or do you think those days have really passed when the fundamentals of climate science were being questioned?
We've certainly moved on. I mean, as I mentioned when I did my presentation, the questions about is climate change happening and the science behind it, I think there's an acceptance that, there's lots of evidence, that overwhelming evidence that climate is changing. We're seeing it already. So there's still a lot out there, I think, with the science itself. And I think particularly to help governments, we need to get down to those regional scales. And again, a graphic I showed, getting down to the UK scale for UK governments. There's a lot of global information there, but it is more challenging when you come down to regions and national level to give the information to people to make decisions, long-term decisions, particularly about climate change adaptation. So there's still overwhelming areas of climate science that we've still got to kind of break into and unlock some of the information that's needed to help decision makers.
Thanks, Liz. And James, this is something I think that the advertising community is looking at, isn't it? Basically, is there a way to sort of take away some of that sometimes unconscious funding of climate denial on sites like YouTube and so on?
Well, it could well become a greater issue as COP gets closer, and disinformation from interested parties gets spread around. It is obviously a concern, and because, again, amongst our members, of course, we count Google, Facebook, other of the big online platforms and social media and beyond. We do very much hope that we'll be able to talk with them, as I'm sure they're already talking with government about the issue and their ability to restrain some of that nonsense.
Yeah, thanks very much. Claire, quickie for you, I think. Any really innovative ideas around sort of harnessing the energy from sport, and such as, for example, capturing the kinetic energy when players are training and playing games and so
on? So a large scale, I don't think we're there yet. I think it's probably PaveGen who does the kinetic tiles. I know they've been rolled out some football concourses and things. Great idea though. I think something like football or athletics, it might not be as strong, but something like basketball, where there's a huge amount of activity in quite a small space. If I was in kinetic energy, that's what I'd be looking at in terms of that sport.
Nice one. Again, I think a quickie, I think for you, Fanny, you sort of alluded to it a little bit. Plans to have some sort of big concert or other events specifically in Glasgow.
Yeah, we'd love to do something like that, and that's something that the Climate Live team have been looking into. What I don't think we want is to try and have an event with a massive audience, because Glasgow, as we've already heard, is going to be overwhelmed. And I also think that the footprint, adding the footprint of that to the footprint of an event that's already going to have a pretty massive footprint, is sends the wrong signals and is the wrong decision. But the great thing about what COVID has done to the live music industry has made us realize how willing people are to watch things online, and how brilliant you can make that experience even in times like these, and we'll have a chance to evolve beyond that. So yes, I would very much hope that we will be in a position to stage something during the event. And I think that, as I say, I would hope that what we'd be able to do is to really drive super powerful messaging at that point about this, the fact that we are, whatever it is. I mean, I've just been looking at Q&As, and I think the point that, I don't know whether you're going to come on to it, but people have been making is, what is the vision for this event? And I have to say, I don't think we've nailed that yet, and I think that, there are many visions, and one of the problems, as we know, is there's no silver bullet. Climate change is massively complex. But for me, I think this Build Back Better, the reboot, the reset, that thing, whatever that looks like in 18 months' time, I think is something that we should be celebrating. And that's what I would want an event to look like. But yes, definitely international stars with very small audiences. In my dream, those audiences would be the climate activists themselves, and also the negotiators if they had time, which they probably don't. Then, but broadcasting out and making this event famous and making it much more accessible. And that's why I'm a bit of a obsessive about getting the message right, because I think we need messages that people can really connect with, and they can connect to their lives. We're going to be unemployed, we're going to be in a depression or a recession, we're still going to be freaked out about our health. We need something that plays into that and doesn't just get, we're not in our bubble of climate. We've got to be beyond that bubble about building a better world. And I think that that's something that pop culture can definitely step into.
Yes, it's about the building better, isn't it, in terms of jobs and things like there's the prospects for ordinary people, not just sort of on a climate change dimension.
And very much not the converted, because the converted, a lot of whom are on this call. There was just one other question I saw that someone said, what about Culture Declares and all the role? I think all of that work is brilliant. I do think it's a bit bubbly. I think, and I think that it's slightly self-selecting. So for me, my challenge that I set myself is, how do I get to the people with the absolutely massive audiences, and how do we drive a conversation that reaches lots of, not just the young people who are already on board, but also the groups that we can see are less convinced or less actively engaged, and make this feel like it's their own. And COVID, I think there's a lot to learn from that. Everybody feels that COVID is their own, and that's obviously partly because it's a real and present danger to everybody. But I think there's probably cultural lessons that we can learn about that too.
Yeah. Gurjit, something that we've seen in recent years is councils and towns and so on declaring climate emergencies. Do you think that COP offers an opportunity for councils and local communities to actually do imaginative things to try and fill in what's often the missing bit here? Okay, it's a climate emergency, so what do we do about it? Or could we have mini COPs, for example, taking place, or sort of action plans that are developed, sparked off by the UK hosting COP26?
Richard, in Scotland, and I suppose globally, the councils are facing huge challenges on their budgets at the moment. But we're fortunate to have something called a City deal. That was half the money from Scottish government, half the money from the UK government. So a lot of that money is now going to be redefined into green investments to accelerate the net transition ambitions of the city. But a lot of these ambitions have to be endorsed and owned by the people that live in these cities. And that type of behavioral change is going to be hugely challenging. So yes, there is a lot that the councils can do, and funnily enough, well, maybe not funnily enough, but it's the COVID experience has really shined a light on how they could accelerate policy changes that would have taken years to have got through all the bureaucracy and naysayers, and action those and then learn from them. So I'm really hoping that there's some good things and long-term legacy changes that happen off the back of this experience.
That's a very interesting point, Gurjit, and actually refers to one of the other questions that's come up. I'm interested to see if any of you have got views on this. Really, I'd toss it open. We have seen certain changes being brought about by this, awful pandemic, which in some ways people quite sort of seem to like having cleaner air and so on. Maybe traveling less and so on. And we've seen big changes in flying and so like this. Have any of you got any ideas about how the good bits of that can be locked in, even as we sort of rebuild, as as sports, as the arts, as everything comes back to normal? How some of these beneficial things can actually be locked in?
Yeah, I can jump in on that from a sport perspective. We very much on the clean air side. We know that for professional sport, one of the biggest footprints is fans travelling to matches, and there's great models that exist globally, like the Combi ticket in Germany for the Bundesliga, and some smaller versions of in Brighton Hove Albion having fan zones for free public transport on match day, etc. So I think sport working with local authorities more to build out more robust public transport efforts where possible, or where public transport isn't available, maybe coaches or car sharing or alternatives. We see that as a massive area. And we also see in sport focusing more on the health and wellness and nutrition side that fits very well with professional sport, and being able to leverage and do more on that in terms of locking in communications and campaigns around healthier eating, etc., and ideas like eating like an athlete, etc., and ways that we can try and keep some of the good stuff that's come out of COVID.
I think in our business, Richard, business travel is ludicrous extravagance in far too many cases. Yeah. It's a status symbol. It's fun and games as well as business, frankly. And what the COVID crisis has demonstrated is that people don't need anything like as much of it as perhaps they like to think they did. And B, of course, it'll save a lot of money as well as benefit climate. It'll save a lot of time, working time, which is of great value to companies. So there's a real no-brainer from our point of view to really try to drive home to people the unacceptability, the moral as well as financial as well as operational imperative of just staying off those airplanes. And if we go back to the ways we were on that particular front, it would be just ridiculous.
Gurjit, you wanted to come in there as well, I think.
Yeah, so we've been looking at this from what we could do to influence people. And there's a great article in The Guardian a couple of years ago that 100 companies produce 71% of global emissions. So what we're trying to do at TEDx is reach out to the employees in these companies and some of the shareholders, and persuade them that the experience that they're having now of not traveling and really having massively reduced their carbon footprint, whether this could continue over the longer term. And that's an area that we think that we could make the biggest impact. If we can persuade these 100 companies to even slightly reduce their carbon footprint, we could make a big dent on the 71% global emissions that they're producing.
And Liz, science is doing things differently, isn't it? The big intergovernmental panel reports that Nigel mentioned, I think a lot of that you would previously have got together in big meetings, and now a lot of that's being done virtually.
Yeah, and that was happening before COVID-19, but has been kind of forced even more upon us. So, there's some big climate conferences that have been done virtual and have been very successful and turned that around in quite a short space of time. I think, inevitably there's going to be a need for some of that face-to-face interaction, but we can certainly get rid of a lot of that. We can still, we've proven, I think, during this COVID-19 pandemic that we can move things forward. We can keep that dialogue going. We can take the science forward without having to have, that travel and meet to face to face.
Funny.
Well, I think from the music industry's footprint itself, as with sport, I think, you know, we've got some time to build back. We're not going to have live audiences for a while, and I think that gives us a real opportunity to restructure the way we do that. And I think public transport is a huge part of that. I think the music industry is just going to be much more online, and performances are going to be much more online, and actually younger audiences seem to love that. And obviously I'm sure they don't love it as much as going to a festival, but they're avid consumers of it. There are concerts going on in computer games. I mean, there's all sorts of things happening, which I think can help. But I think, you know, I think it's back to that brain print, back to the what do people aspire to. And one of my favorite statistics in the whole crisis was quite early on, and I'm not sure whether it would stand as much now, but there was a survey done in the UK which showed that only 9% of people wanted to go back to normal. And I think that, you know, I think there's so much, I think, and again, building the positive. So it's not just saying don't do the bad stuff. It's like relish what we've got by not being on a plane all the time and by being able to hear the birds. And I think that would be my final point. We haven't talked about nature very much throughout all of this. And I did see a question, someone was saying, could nature be a big COP theme? And my previous job was at WWF. And I think there's no question for me that if we want to deal with it, you know, deal with climate change, we've got to give nature put nature much more center stage in the negotiations. But actually, I think it's a fantastic way of connecting people to what we're doing. You know, the planting trees, the restoring ecosystems, the bringing back ocean health, all of those things are very emotional, brilliant stories to tell, really positive ones that are kind of more interesting than solar panels and public transport. And I think that then leaps us back to what we're experiencing now. You know, we hear the birds, we see the birds. I saw today on the news there was a kind of extinct species of chinchilla has just been discovered again after 100 years because they were too frightened to come out because the tourists in whatever Latin America country they were living in had frightened them off for like a century, and they've come out again. And I think that's the kind of symbol we need, is bringing nature back as well as we rebuild. I think that's going to be really exciting for people.
Excellent. Alison, do come in on that, but there's also one final question that's come up on the chat that I'd like to just get your view on as well, which is basically how certain can we be that these new dates for COP26 will actually stand? You know, is there a prospect that it might be delayed again, and if so, what happens?
I just on that one. I think it'll have to stand. I mean, climate change doesn't stop and wait until the next climate conference. It goes on and on and on. Okay, currently at a slightly reduced level, and we want that bounce back not to be as high. But let's see. But it still goes on. We still have far too much carbon going into the atmosphere. So I think if it continues to be a concern, the COVID concern, I think this hybrid model will appear. And I think we all have to adjust our plans and make it much more virtual, make sure there's enough noise going on. And I think this noise I've really enjoyed hearing this positive attitude towards COP. But I still think there are governments out there, and I won't name anyone, who want that to be the gloss. Let's all present the niceness, and actually business as usual. Our economic investments will be in fossil fuels, getting flights back, getting us all traveling in our cars again. So that's normal. That's the normal economy. Let's do these nice glosses on top. And we can't have that mismatch of what's happening here and what we all think we're doing nice. We need real actual change. And I think all of this positivism has to turn into a real world economy change. And that's the tough thing that the COPs are about, is actually saying, no, you can't continue doing that. We need to change our attitude to fossil fuels. We need to have a new think of our food systems, of our travel systems. So it is quite a big transformation. And I think all this positivism, this really needs to, we need to, I think people are scared also a bit of they want climate change to stop, but they're scared of the change they have to make. And again, all this positivism that the future is good, is really in helping people be positive that there is a good change. So it's matching that with the scale of change that is actually needed by governments, by business around the world, and making sure they deliver while we deliver.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, we're going to wrap it up there because we are bang on time. So just before we sign off, finally, I'd like to thank all of our panelists, including Nigel Topping, who you can't see on the screen. It's been absolutely fantastic to have you all. Just to say, this was really the start of what for ECIU is a process. I guess it's going to be an 18-month process now. We'd love to hear from you. What ideas have you gleaned from this? What are you cooking? We run a newsletter which we put out every couple of weeks roughly. It's your newsletter as a big community of people interested in COP26. We'd love to have your ideas. We'd love to have your input. If you'd like us to run any more of these things on specific issues, we'd be more than happy to do that. It's kind of what we're here for. I need to thank Lindsay, who you can see on screen, and another of our colleagues, Kathy Grenville, who you can't see on screen, for putting this thing together. If you want to subscribe to the newsletter, you can look it on our website, eciu.net. If you've got any ideas, you can email Lindsay, lindsay.smith@eciu.net, and keep following us on Twitter. And we want to play our role in making this an absolutely fantastic 18 months, engaging 18 months up until COP26. So thanks all for joining. Have a good Friday.
Thank you.